started quietly like most big things do, not with explosions or sirens, but with a strange hush in places that should have been loud. In the far north of Canada, where the cold bites deep and the nights stretch for hours, elders from the Inuit communities began noticing something odd in the sky. The northern lights, those dancing ribbons of green and violet they'd watched for generations, were changing. Not just shifting colors, but forming shapes, faces even. Some looked like they were crying. Others stared straight down, eyes wide with something that felt too much like sorrow to ignore. At first, people thought it was just the mind playing tricks. After all, when you stare long enough into the dark, your eyes start seeing what your heart already feels. But then photos started coming in, from hunters, from pilots, from teenagers with shaky phone cameras. And they all showed the same thing. The aurora wasn't just glowing anymore. It was expressing. Down in Chile, a scientist working with global weather data saw the reports and frowned. She'd spent her life studying the atmosphere, how it breathes, how it reacts, how it carries the weight of human choices. She didn't believe in ghosts or omens, but she did believe in patterns, and when she pulled up satellite images from the same nights the faces appeared, she saw something that made her pause. The ionosphere, the electric layer of air high above the planet, was behaving in ways no model had ever predicted. Not random, not chaotic, almost intentional. She called colleagues in Kenya, where drought had turned rivers to dust and cracked the earth like old pottery. "Have you seen anything strange in the sky lately?" she asked. The answer came fast, yes. During the worst heat wave in memory, people swore the clouds above Nairobi formed a face, mouth open, as if gasping for rain that never came. Then came word from Pakistan, still reeling from floods that swallowed entire villages. Their fishermen on the Indus River said the storm clouds gathered into a weeping woman's profile just before the levees broke. It wasn't just one place. It was everywhere the earth was hurting the most. News outlets picked it up slowly at first. A quirky human interest piece here, a short clip there. Sky looks sad, coincidence or climate signal. But as more photos surfaced, from Siberia to the Amazon, from California's burning hills to the melting ice sheets of Greenland, the tone shifted. People weren't just curious anymore. They were uneasy, because the faces in the sky didn't look angry. They looked grieved, and grief, unlike anger, doesn't demand revenge. It asks one quiet question: do you see me? Most scientists stayed cautious. Atmospheric optics, they said. Light refraction. Pareidolia. The brain seeing faces in clouds like seeing Jesus in a toast. And maybe that was part of it. But even the skeptics couldn't explain why these faces only appeared over places where ecosystems were collapsing, where forests were vanishing, where oceans were turning acidic. Why did the sky over the Great Barrier Reef show a face with closed eyes the week 60% of the coral bleached white? Why did the smoke from wildfires in Greece twist into a silent scream, just as a village burned to the ground? People began watching the sky differently, not just for weather but for meaning. Farmers in India paused midfield, squinting upward during dry spells. School kids in Norway stopped playing at recess to stare at the clouds, wondering if today would be the day the sky showed them something new. In cities, people who hadn't looked up in years, too busy with phones, traffic bills, found themselves glancing at the horizon, half hoping, half dreading what they might see. Governments tried to calm things down. No scientific basis, read the official statements. Natural phenomena misinterpreted due to emotional stress. But the more they denied it, the more people trusted their own eyes. Especially those who'd lived close to the land their whole lives. The fishermen, the shepherds, the forest keepers. They didn't need data to tell them something had changed. They felt it in their bones. The wind carried a different weight. The birds sang at odd hours. And the sky had started witnessing. One evening, in a small coastal town in the Philippines still rebuilding after a super typhoon, a group of children gathered on the beach. They'd heard the stories. They'd seen the blurry images online, so they waited. The sun dipped low, painting the clouds in gold and red. Then as twilight settled, the high clouds began to shift. Not fast, not dramatic, but slowly, like someone drawing with mist. A curve formed. Then an eye. Then a brow furrowed with worry. The kids didn't scream. They didn't run. They just stood there silent, as if meeting a long-lost relative. Back in the lab, the scientist from Chile stared at a new satellite feed. Over the Amazon, where illegal logging had carved fresh wounds into the rainforest. The clouds had gathered into a face so clear it sent a chill down her spine. It wasn't distorted. It wasn't fuzzy. It was looking right at the camera, mouth slightly open, as if trying to say something the world hadn't been listening to for decades. She leaned back in her chair, heart pounding not from fear, but from a terrible kind of clarity. Maybe the earth had been mourning all along, in the silence of extinct frogs, in the empty nests of vanished birds, in the slow death of glaciers, but no one heard. So now it was using the one canvas everyone could see, the sky, and it wasn't whispering anymore. It was showing its face. People still argued. Experts still debated. But something had shifted in the air, literally and in the human spirit. You couldn't unsee what you'd seen. And once you believed the planet might be feeling, not just existing, everything changed. The way you walked on grass, the way you turned off lights, the way you looked up before going to bed just to check, was the sky watching back? No one knew what it meant yet. But everyone knew this. The earth wasn't silent anymore. And whatever came next, it wouldn't be ignored. The strange faces in the sky didn't fade away. If anything, they grew clearer, more frequent, and harder to ignore. What had started as whispers in remote villages and blurry phone photos soon became impossible to dismiss, because now the sky wasn't just showing sorrow over quiet tragedies. It was reacting to disasters happening in real time, right in front of millions. In Australia, during one of the worst wildfire seasons anyone could remember, the smoke didn't just rise, it gathered. High above the burning eucalyptus forests, thick plumes twisted and curled until they formed a massive face, eyes closed tight, mouth open in what looked like a silent scream. Pilots flying over the coast captured it on camera. News helicopters circled it like it was a storm system. People on the ground, coughing through ash-filled air, looked up and froze. It wasn't just smoke. It felt like a message. At the same time, on the other side of the world, Jakarta was drowning. Weeks of relentless rain had turned streets into rivers and homes into islands. As families waded through chest-deep water, trying to save what little they could, the clouds above them swirled into something unmistakable, a pair of weeping eyes, tears blending with the downpour. Locals filmed it from rooftops. Within hours, the image was everywhere. Not as a meme, not as a joke, but as a shared moment of awe and unease. Social media lit up. Hashtags like "My Sky is Crying" and "Earth is Watching" trended for days. Some people posted prayers. Others shared scientific theories. A few claimed it was all a government hoax or a trick of the light. But even the doubters couldn't explain why these sky faces always appeared exactly where the land was suffering the most. Not over quiet suburbs or untouched mountains, but over oil spills, over clear-cut forests, over coral reefs bleached bone-white by warming seas. Governments tried to stay calm. Official statements called it atmospheric coincidence or mass psychological projection. But behind closed doors, emergency meetings were happening. Climate agencies scrambled to understand what was happening in the upper atmosphere. Was it a new kind of cloud formation? A reaction to pollution? Or something deeper, something they weren't ready to admit? Meanwhile, elders from indigenous communities around the world weren't surprised at all. In Aotearoa, Maori leaders spoke of Papatuanuku, the Earth Mother, who had always been alive, always listening. They said she wasn't angry. She was heartbroken. And now, after centuries of being ignored, she was finally making her pain visible. In the plains of North America, Lakota knowledge keepers shared similar stories. The land and sky were never separate. They breathed together, and if one cried, the other would echo it. This wasn't superstition to them. It was memory, a way of seeing the world that modern science had long dismissed, but that now felt startlingly real. Back in the global science community, the Chilean researcher who'd first noticed the patterns was no longer working alone. She'd reached out to climate refugees, forest rangers, oceanographers, and even artists. Together, they started mapping every reported sky face against real-time environmental data. The results were chilling. Every single one lined up with a major ecological wound. A new oil spill off the coast of Nigeria, a sudden spike in illegal logging in Borneo, a record-breaking heat wave in the Middle East. The sky wasn't random. It was responding, like a mirror held up to human actions. One night, she sat in her small apartment, staring at a wall covered in printed images and notes. A photo from Kenya showed a sky face hovering over a dried-up lake where hippos once bathed. Another from Brazil showed a sorrowful profile forming just hours after a protected reserve was set on fire. She felt a lump in her throat. This wasn't just data anymore. It was a plea, and people were starting to hear it. In Oslo, a group of teenagers organized what they called a silent sky vigil. They stood in the city square at dusk, not chanting, not holding signs, just looking up. Eyes wide open, faces calm. They stayed like that for an hour, then left without a word. The next week, similar vigils popped up in Cape Town, Seoul, and Buenos Aires. No leaders, no organizations, just ordinary people saying, in the quietest way possible, we see you. In rural India, farmers who'd spent lifetimes reading the sky for rain now read it for something else. When a patch of clouds shaped into a gentle, watching face over their fields, they didn't panic. They bowed their heads. Then they got to work, planting native trees, digging rainwater pits, refusing to burn crop stubble. If the sky is grieving, one elder told a local reporter, then we must heal what we've broken. Even in big cities, change began in small ways. People started turning off lights earlier. Carpooling became cool again. Plastic bags disappeared from grocery stores not because of laws, but because customers simply stopped using them. It wasn't perfect. Old habits didn't vanish overnight. But something had shifted in the air, literally and in people's hearts. Then came the video that changed everything. It was shot by a drone operator flying over the Amazon. Below, bulldozers were tearing through ancient trees, clearing land for cattle. Smoke rose in thick columns, and right above the destruction, the clouds formed a face so clear it looked like it had been painted by hand. But this time it wasn't crying. It was watching, eyes wide open, steady, unblinking. The drone hovered for nearly a minute before the face slowly dissolved into mist. The video went viral in less than 24 hours. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was quietly devastating. No music, no voiceover, just the hum of the drone and the sound of chainsaws in the distance. Millions watched it, and millions felt the same thing. Shame, yes, but also a strange sense of connection. Like the planet wasn't some distant rock floating in space. It was alive, and it knew what was being done to it. Protests erupted, not violent ones, but peaceful marches where people carried mirrors instead of signs, symbolizing reflection. Artists painted murals of sky faces on abandoned buildings. Schools added Earth listening sessions to their curriculum, where kids sat outside and wrote down what they felt the land was trying to say. The sky didn't speak in words. It spoke in shapes, in light, in silence, and slowly humanity began to understand its language. No one knew if this would last. Would people go back to ignoring the Earth once the faces faded? Maybe. But for now, something had cracked open, not in the sky, but in human awareness. The planet wasn't just a resource to use. It was a presence to respect, and if the sky could mourn, maybe it could also forgive. But only if people started acting like they belonged to it, not the other way around. As the sky kept showing its faces, sometimes weeping, sometimes watching, always over places where the Earth was hurting, people didn't just feel moved. They started reacting, and like any big shift in human behavior, it didn't happen smoothly. It split the world in ways no one expected. On one side were those who saw the sky as a warning, a cry for help, maybe even a sacred sign. They gathered in parks, schools, and village squares not to protest but to listen. They planted trees in silence. They stopped buying things wrapped in plastic. They walked instead of driving, not to make a statement, but because it felt like the right thing to do when the sky was watching. For them, the faces weren't scary, they were heartbreaking. And heartbreak, when shared, can turn into action, but not everyone felt that way. Others saw the sky faces as a threat, not from the Earth, but from each other. Conspiracy theories spread like wildfire. Some claimed it was a secret government project using drones and lasers to control the weather. Others said it was aliens testing human emotions. A few even insisted it was a trick by eco-terrorists trying to scare people into giving up modern life. Online forums buzzed with fear and anger. "They're trying to make us feel guilty for living," one post read. Next they'll ban cars, then meat, then breathing. Big companies felt the pressure too. Fossil fuel giants launched slick ad campaigns showing happy families and clean energy logos, all while quietly lobbying against climate laws. Tech billionaires, the kind who talked about colonizing Mars, started funding wild ideas like sky filters, giant satellites that could supposedly block or blur the strange cloud formations. If people are scared of the sky, one executive reportedly said, we'll just give them a nicer view. Religious groups were divided as well. Some preachers called the sky faces a divine judgment, proof that humanity had strayed too far from grace. Crowds gathered at churches, mosques, and temples praying for forgiveness. Others pushed back, saying the earth wasn't punishing anyone. It was suffering alongside us. This isn't wrath, said a pastor in a small town in Georgia. This is shared pain, and pain calls for healing, not fear. Meanwhile, in classrooms and community centers, something quieter but just as powerful was happening. Kids who'd grown up with climate anxiety, worried they'd never see snow or that their coastal hometowns would vanish, suddenly felt less alone. If the sky was showing grief, it meant the planet cared. And if it cared, maybe it wasn't too late. In Oslo, a group of students started a sky journal where they drew what they saw each evening and wrote letters back to the earth. In Nairobi, teens organized neighborhood cleanups saying, if the sky cries over trash in our rivers, we'll be the ones to pull it out. Then came the day everything changed at the United Nations. A scientist, quiet, tired-looking but with eyes that had seen too much, stood at the podium in Geneva. She didn't bring flashy graphics or dramatic music, just data, charts, photos, and a simple truth. Every sky face matched a real measurable wound on the planet. She showed how carbon levels spiked just before a weeping cloud appeared over the Arctic, how deforestation alerts lit up hours before a sorrowful face formed over the Congo Basin. She didn't say the Earth was alive. She didn't need to. The evidence spoke for itself. The room was silent when she finished. Not because they were convinced, but because they couldn't easily dismiss it anymore. Outside the UN building, people held signs that said, "We see you and sorry for the smoke." But online, the backlash was fierce. Memes mocked the scientist. Talk shows debated whether sky grief was real or mass hysteria. Yet even in the noise, something shifted. Insurance companies started raising rates for regions with high ecological damage, citing atmospheric instability. Tourists canceled trips to places where the sky had recently shown distress. Investors quietly pulled money from companies tied to heavy pollution. The most surprising change came from ordinary people who'd never cared much about the environment before. A truck driver in Texas started turning off his engine at rest stops instead of idling for hours. A grandmother in Manila began collecting rainwater to water her plants, saying, "If the sky is crying, I won't waste its tears." A chef in Barcelona removed beef from his menu, not for health or trend, but because he'd seen a sky face form over a cattle ranch during a drought, and it haunted him. But the real turning point happened in Iceland. The country had already held a funeral for its first glacier lost to warming Ökjökull years earlier. Now, as another ice sheet shrank faster than predicted, locals gathered again. This time, they didn't just read a eulogy. They stood in a circle on the bare rock where ice once lay thick, holding hands, heads bowed, and above them, as if on cue, the clouds gathered, not into a crying face, not into a scream, but into a single open palm facing downward, gentle, almost like a blessing. Someone filmed it. The video had no music, no narration, just wind, silence, and that sky palm hanging over a group of humans saying goodbye to something they'd failed to protect. Within days, that image was everywhere. It wasn't angry. It wasn't demanding. It was forgiving. And that's what broke people open, because forgiveness is harder to ignore than fear. Suddenly, the conversation changed. It wasn't about blame anymore. It was about repair. Cities announced plans to become carbon neutral faster. Farmers switched to regenerative practices, not because they were forced to, but because they felt ashamed to keep hurting land that was clearly feeling pain. Even skeptics began to pause before tossing plastic or leaving lights on. What if the sky sees? Became a quiet question in homes around the world. Of course, not everyone changed. Some doubled down. Others laughed it off. But the tide had turned, not with laws or wars, but with a shared moment of human humility. For the first time in a long time, people weren't just thinking about saving the planet for future generations. They were thinking about apologizing to it right now. And in that apology, a new kind of hope began to grow. Not the loud, flashy kind, but the quiet, stubborn kind that shows up when you finally stop pretending you're separate from the world around you. The sky hadn't punished anyone. It had simply shown its heart. And in doing so, it reminded humanity of its own. The turning didn't happen with a bang or a grand announcement. It started small, like a single seed cracking open in dry soil. People had seen the sky's sorrow, felt its quiet plea, and for the first time they weren't just scared or guilty. They wanted to respond, not with grand promises, but with real daily choices. In labs and living rooms, a new kind of work began. Scientists, artists, elders, and even school kids came together, not to prove the sky was alive, but to understand what it was trying to say. They called it resonance mapping. It wasn't magic. It was careful listening. They matched satellite images of sky faces with data on air quality, ocean temperatures, forest loss, and even human activity like mining or shipping. And slowly a pattern emerged. The sky didn't just mirror damage, it mirrored emotion. When a coral reef died, the clouds above looked numb. When a wildfire raged, they looked panicked. But when people planted trees or cleaned a river, the sky grew calmer. Not instantly, but over time, like a deep breath being released. One breakthrough came from a quiet collaboration between a sound engineer and an atmospheric physicist. They discovered that the way light bent through disturbed air, over oil spills for example, created subtle vibrations. When translated into sound, it wasn't noise. It was a low, mournful hum. Over healthy forests, soft, steady tone, almost like a lullaby. They didn't claim the earth was singing, but they did say it was vibrating with feeling, and humans, if they paid attention, could feel it too. This idea spread faster than any policy ever could. In villages across India, farmers began starting their days not by checking the weather app, but by standing outside, eyes closed, just feeling the air. If it felt heavy, they'd delay burning crop waste. If it felt light, they'd plant seeds. In Norway, school children learned to read the sky like a mood chart, not for science class, but for empathy class. Is the sky sad today? Became a real question asked with care, not mockery. Then came the funeral in Iceland, the one for the glacier. It wasn't just a ceremony. It was a moment the whole world seemed to hold its breath for. People gathered on bare rock where ice had once stood for thousands of years. No speeches, no cameras at first, just silence. And then, as if the sky had been waiting, the clouds above formed that open palm. Not pointing, not accusing, just reaching. That image did what years of climate reports couldn't. It made grief visible, and in doing so, made it shareable. Within weeks, similar gatherings popped up everywhere. In Kenya, communities held tree funerals for forests lost to drought, planting new saplings in their place. In the Philippines, fishermen released biodegradable lanterns into the sea to honor coral reefs gone white. These weren't protests. They were apologies, and they were powerful because they came from the heart, not from a slogan. Governments, slow as ever, began to notice, not because of pressure, but because people's behavior was changing on its own. Cities saw fewer plastic bottles in gutters. Power usage dropped during heat waves as neighbors shared fans instead of cranking AC. Carpool lanes filled up not because of fines, but because people didn't want to add to the smoke that made the sky cry. Investors took note too. Companies that bragged about sustainability suddenly saw their stocks rise. Those still tied to old dirty practices lost customers overnight, not because of boycotts, but because people just stopped buying. A mother in Brazil chose a local soap bar wrapped in paper over an imported brand in plastic, simply because she'd seen a sky face over a landfill last week. That one choice multiplied millions of times, shifted markets. The biggest surprise? How fast young people led the way. They didn't wait for permission. In São Paulo, teens turned an abandoned lot into a food forest, using rainwater and compost. In Jakarta, students built floating gardens in flooded streets to absorb pollution and grow vegetables. They didn't call it activism. They called it making peace with the sky, and the sky seemed to notice. The faces didn't disappear, but they changed. Less weeping, less screaming, more watching, more waiting. Over newly planted forests in Costa Rica, the clouds formed gentle eyes, half closed like someone resting after a long illness. Over a river in South Korea that had been cleaned after decades of pollution, the mist shaped into a soft smile, faint but unmistakable. People began to wonder, was the earth healing? Or were they just finally seeing it differently? Maybe both. The real shift wasn't just in what people did, it was in how they saw themselves. They weren't separate from nature anymore. They were part of it. When a bird returned to a city park after years of absence, it felt like a gift. When rain fell after a drought, it felt like forgiveness. And when the sky stayed clear and calm for days, it felt like trust. Of course, there were setbacks. Old habits crept back. Some places ignored the change. But the difference now was that people knew. They'd seen the face of the planet in pain. And once you've seen that, you can't unsee it, so they kept going, not perfectly, but persistently. A farmer in Kenya switched to drought-resistant crops and shared seeds with neighbors. A mechanic in Detroit started converting old cars to run on cleaner fuel, just because he didn't want the sky looking at me like that anymore. A grandmother in Vietnam taught her grandchildren to weave baskets from river reeds instead of buying plastic bins. Small acts, quiet acts, but together they added up to something new, a culture of care. And then, one morning, something unexpected happened. Over a restored prairie in the American Midwest, once paved over, now blooming with native grasses and wildflowers, the dawn sky didn't form a face at all. Instead, the clouds shaped into a child's hand, fingers slightly curled as if reaching down. Not to take, not to warn, but to connect. People didn't panic. They didn't film it for likes. They just stood there, some with tears in their eyes, and raised their own hands in return. That was the moment it became clear. The earth wasn't just mourning anymore. It was remembering how to hope. And it was waiting to see if humanity would walk with it, not as masters, but as partners. The sky hadn't changed the world. People had, and the sky was finally smiling back. The change didn't happen overnight, and it wasn't perfect, but it was real. By 2026, something quiet and steady had taken root in the way people lived. It wasn't forced by laws or fear. It grew from a simple, shared understanding. The earth wasn't just a place we lived on. It was a presence we lived with. And after everything it had shown us, through smoke, through storms, through those haunting faces in the clouds, we owed it more than silence. We owed it care. Global carbon emissions had dropped by over 30%, not because of one big treaty, but because millions of small choices added up. Cities redesigned streets for bikes and buses instead of cars. Factories switched to solar not just to save money, but because workers asked, what would the sky think? Even fashion brands started using plant-based dyes and natural fibers after a viral photo showed a sky face forming over a polluted river near a textile plant. People didn't just buy less, they chose better. In the countryside, the shift was even deeper. Farmers stopped seeing soil as something to squeeze for profit and started treating it like a living thing, which of course it always was. They planted cover crops to feed the earth, not just the market. They let fields rest. In India, entire villages revived ancient water harvesting systems their grandparents had used, filling wells that had been dry for decades. And every time rain came, they thanked the sky, not with words, but by protecting what it gave them. Kids grew up differently now. In schools from Oslo to Nairobi, earth listening became part of the week, just like math or reading. Children sat outside, eyes closed, feeling the wind, listening to birds, noticing if the air felt heavy or light. They learned that caring for the planet wasn't a chore, it was a conversation. And sometimes, if you were very still, you could feel the earth listening back. The sky still changed, but not like before. The weeping faces were rare now. When they did appear, it was usually over places still hurting. A new oil spill, a sudden forest fire sparked by old negligence. But even then, the response was faster. Within hours, volunteers would arrive. Drones would map the damage. Donations would pour in. And people would look up, not with fear, but with a promise. We're fixing this. The biggest shift came in how people saw themselves. No one talked about saving the planet like it was some far-off mission. They talked about healing their street, their river, their neighborhood forest, because they finally understood. The earth didn't need saving from humans. It needed healing with them. In 2025, the United Nations adopted something new, not another climate agreement full of fine print, but the Sky Accord. It wasn't about numbers or deadlines. It was about values. Every country that signed agreed to measure progress not just by tons of carbon reduced, but by how much life returned. Birds nesting again, rivers running clear, children playing outside without masks. They called it ecological empathy. The idea that policy should come from feeling, not just data. And it worked. Because when people felt connected, they acted like it. One spring morning, a scientist who'd spent years studying the sky stood on a restored prairie in Montana. The land had once been paved over, then abandoned, then slowly brought back to life by local hands. Wildflowers bloomed where concrete used to be. Bees buzzed. Birds called from young trees. She looked up, not with instruments or cameras, but with her own eyes. Above her, the dawn clouds were shifting, not into a face of sorrow, not into a warning, but into something gentle, a child's hand, fingers slightly curled as if reaching down from the sky. It wasn't dramatic. It lasted only a few minutes before melting back into morning mist. But she didn't look away. Instead, she raised her own hand, palm open, and held it there for a long time. She wasn't praying. She wasn't performing. She was simply answering. That moment, repeated in small ways across the world, became the new normal. People didn't wait for permission to care. They just did. A fisherman in the Philippines stopped using nets that harmed coral and taught others to do the same. A baker in Berlin switched to locally milled flour and put a sign in her window, made with grain that didn't make the sky cry. A group of teens in Chile turned a vacant lot into a community garden, naming it the sky's backyard. There were still challenges, of course. Old systems didn't vanish overnight. Some places lagged behind. But the difference now was hope, and it wasn't blind optimism. It was the kind of hope that comes after you've faced something hard and chosen to stay kind anyway. The sky never spoke in words, but it had said everything it needed to. It showed grief when we heard it. It showed watching eyes when we ignored it. And now, slowly, it was showing something new. Trust. Not because the earth forgot what happened, but because it saw us trying, and that was enough. People began to celebrate differently, too. Instead of big fireworks that choked the air, towns held sky Thanksgivings, evenings where everyone turned off their lights, lit candles, and just looked up together. No speeches, no music, just shared silence under a sky that no longer felt distant but close, like a friend who'd been waiting for us to finally understand. In homes, bedtime routines changed. Parents didn't just tell kids to brush their teeth and go to sleep. They'd say, "Did you thank the earth today?" And the child might say, "I picked up trash at the park," or "I turned off the tap while brushing," or "I hugged a tree." And the parent would smile, look out the window and whisper, "Good." The sky noticed. The world wasn't perfect, but it was healing. And in that healing, something beautiful happened. People remembered they belonged here. Not as owners, not as visitors, but as part of a living, breathing family that included rivers, wolves, soil, wind, and yes, even the sky. Years later, when new generations asked, what happened when the sky turned human? The elders wouldn't talk about data or disasters. They'd say, it didn't turn human. It reminded us that we're Earth too. And that was the real miracle. Not that the sky showed a face, but that we finally learned how to see it.